So thank you. Thank you because as I learned from you this morning, I now have have an appreciation for what a day in the life of an MPN patient is. And here we are at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you all are still here doing what you told me you do, which is push through. You don't give up, and you're here and have made your voices heard today. So thank you. I also want to thank you because you all have been wonderful participants and allowed me, an outsider to your community, to work with you throughout the day and share such personal, such emotional topics. And I know that's not easy. I know there's a lot of strangers in the room, but hopefully you all have made a lot of friends within your own community. And I know from my experience that what you've shared today is going to have an impact, and we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to stop and say thank you. So with that, I would like to, we're going to transition from our now discussion with all of you to now hearing a recap about what we've explored throughout the day. And to lead us in that recap, we have two wonderful experts from your own community that are going to be sharing with us their takeaways from the day. So we have Dr. John Mascarenas, who's an associate professor of medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and is a member of the Tisch Cancer Institute. He is also the director of the Adult Leukemia Program and leader of the clinical investigation within the Myeloproliferative Disorders Program at Mount Sinai. We also have Dr. Ruben Mesa, who's the director of UT Health San Antonio MD Anderson Cancer Center, where he has been involved in MPN research for more than 20 years. He's led the development of the NCCN panel guidelines, the first U.S. guidelines on the diagnosis and treatment of MF, PV, and ET, and has been the principal investigator or co-principal investigator on more than 70 clinical trials. So we're in very good hands to lead us through this summary of the day. And again, thank you.
Well, so it's up to myself and my good friend John to try to bring some closure and try to bring together several of the themes that we've heard here today. But first, let me echo what I think has been expressed several times, and that's really tremendous gratitude really for all of you. It takes tremendous bravery to come up and speak in front of an audience, particularly when you're not used to it, and to do so on such a deeply personal and emotional set of topics is incredibly brave. Indeed, there's not a day that I'm not inspired by the cohesiveness, the bravery, the camaraderie of the NPN community. It's one of the things, as someone that's been an investigator trying to help over now these past 28 years, that I have found really incredibly rewarding. Indeed, as I've heard many of the themes today, many of these things really arose because of advocacy from patients themselves. So we're deeply indebted to folks like Bob Rosen, Joyce Niblack, and others who really were pioneers in terms of the patient voice playing a central role in identifying disease burden and trying to drive the evolution to new therapies. Certainly deeply grateful to Anne Farrell and her colleagues. I know how incredibly busy they are, and to spend an entire day with us here listening to these challenges firsthand, is a very generous gift of their time, and hopefully one that has been well spent. And certainly I'm grateful for the degree of interest trying to really make a difference in MPNs. When my colleagues and I tried to develop clinical trials for MPNs over 20 years ago, it was very difficult to have engaged partners from the pharmaceutical industry to really focus on these diseases. In fact, it was almost non-existent. So to have almost a dozen companies and others really have this as a priority is incredibly important. It takes energy, it takes resources and others. So what are some of the key themes that we heard today? Without question, and someone brought this up at lunch, what is our goal? make no mistake, our goal is to cure MPNs. That is a goal of us researchers. That clearly is a goal for all of you as patients and loved ones and caregivers. Now, while we strive for that and be assured that that is what is being striven for each and every day, but that's difficult. It's difficult. So part of what we're discussing today is really also in parallel. While that is the utopian goal, we clearly want to help everyone under our care as much as physically and humanly possible each and every day until we achieve that goal. So what are those goals? Well, first, we've certainly heard today many aspects of the burden of the disease. And again, realizing the tremendous heterogeneity, including those that are way too ill to even be here for us to hear their voice. And John will touch a little bit further on those. One of those burdens clearly is very few options. In fact, in terms of really approved options, you know, I could put them all on one hand and I could take a few fingers away. You know, so it's very, very few options, how they're used, artfully used, and how we largely have used many therapies that are not approved for their indication, but we use them in standard place in our guidelines, is clearly a key part. So certainly that is key. People need options. Even when therapies are helpful, they don't help everyone, and the spectrum of reaction to any particular drug can be from very favorable to unfavorable, on and on. The more options, really the better, without question. Second, we certainly have heard the tremendous spectrum of the difficult symptoms NPN patients can face. And the symptoms don't exist in a vacuum. They are a sign of the disease. They are linked to the biology of the disease. They are not just out of thin air. They really have a close correlation. And we've learned many things. One, we've learned that there are a range of things that can be a great burden on your quality of life that sometimes have been difficult to quantify but are very important. Fatigue, difficulties with concentration, all sorts of things that really impact the ability to be fully employed, and the economic, social, and personal impact that that has is huge. I have cared for many physicians, even hematologists, who develop MPNs, and they come to see me and they said, well, I never really believed somebody could tell when their platelets were high until it happened to me. And sure enough, when my platelets are high, I can tell. I can't read a full journal article, I can't concentrate, I can't see a full day's worth of patients. Or if I need a phlebotomy, I am not functioning right. So we've learned that there is that spectrum without question, and we've heard that very passionately from many of you, and how that really impacts your daily lives and the choices that you make. Now, what level of improvement in whatever goal we have is clinically meaningful? And I've had the opportunity to work in very specific ways around specific trial discussions with Dr. Farrell and her colleagues. And again, that is a frequent topic of discussion. What is the clinical benefit that really merits a therapy being a consideration? Always weighed against what are the risks or the toxicity that a patient faces. Now, as a medical community, John and I and our colleagues came up with arbitrary starting places. Well, if you have a big spleen, maybe if it shrinks by 50%, that sounds good. We got 10 people around the table, we take a vote. How many think that should be 50%? 6 people raise their hands, it's 50%. What is the improvement in symptoms that should be marked as a response? And again, that was a arbitrary decision of 50%. What we've learned over time is that improvement in these things exists on a spectrum. And for the right patient, that improvement by a third, 25%, 40%, 80%, whatever that is, might make a significant benefit in their impact on quality of life. In part because some of these have really been linked to be almost a biomarker of the disease. We identified patients that have a true response in their spleen with therapy, probably greater than even 10%, probably have a clinically meaningful benefit that may even be associated with living longer. So I think the improvement in these things exists on a spectrum. We've heard the burden that each of you have faced with these. And again, who would not value a significant reduction even if it didn't reach that absolute threshold? And then the final thing I'll cover is really the improvement of the issue of counts. Because I am also mindful that in the United States, the majority of hematologists judge how your disease is doing by looking at your CBC. Look at your CBC, and they look at it and they say, well, the counts look good, I guess you must be okay. And I think what we've learned over time is that the counts are part of the equation, but not the full equation. Similarly, we had arbitrary thresholds of what does response in counts mean. Platelet count under 400,000, a white count under 10, a hematocrit without phlebotomy. All of these have value. But what we have learned is that there, again, is a spectrum. If your platelets were 2 million and now they're 450,000, are you not better off? You're probably dramatically better off. You probably feel much better. Much of your symptoms are much improved. Your risk of having a clot is improved. You didn't hit that number of 400, but that number of 400 was pulled out of thin air. So again, we have learned that there is a spectrum, and how do we weave that in as we try to understand the clinical benefit of therapies weighed against their risk. John?
So I want to first start off by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this meeting. And I, with Ruben, have spoken at many MPN conferences, and usually it's us speaking to us about you guys, and you guys are often not in the room. So it's nice to have you guys in the room as a stakeholder in this, and to be inspired by your stories. And these are stories I hear every day from my own patients. So I hear them, and as each person spoke, I thought of patients I take care of and some of the similarities. But one of the things that really impresses me about MPN patients, and when I have a medical student, a resident, or fellow who rotates with me, I always try to impart this, is that you will never meet two patients that are the same. That the patients really differ, and that makes it very complicated, very challenging to treat patients with MPNs. It also makes it very rewarding, but it really focuses or forces the physician to consider that the 20 patients they're going to see in a day are not going to show up with the same problems and have the same responses to the medications that we give. You really have to think beyond that. And when you see ET, PV, and MF patients, obviously there's a biology that overlaps, but there's a lot of clinical symptoms that can be distinct and overlapped at the same time. One of the things that came out in this meeting and that Ruben and I have talked about before is the burden of transfusion dependence. And this is obviously particular to patients with myelofibrosis and not to ET and PV. But this is a major problem for patients with MF. As a hematologist, we prescribe transfusions frequently. In fact, at any given time in my infusion suite on the 4th floor of our Cancer Institute, you can find a number of my patients that are sitting there getting 1 unit or 2 units. But when you sit as a physician, sit down and start to think about what is the impact of that, it's tremendous. And it's not simply getting a red blood cell transfusion to improve hemoglobin level. It's to continue the energy level so the patients can continue to be active and engage in life. But it also has a negative influence. It takes a patient out of commission for an entire day. And I don't care if your hematologist says, oh, we'll give you 1 unit, you'll be out of here early. That never happens, and you know that. So basically, it's the full day. It takes you out. And for some patients, they don't even enjoy the benefit of the transfusion until the next day. So it's not such a simple thing to have someone who's red blood cell transfusion dependent. And some patients can be very dependent and need transfusions every week to get by. So to me, and I think Ruben and many of us in the room would agree, the burden of red blood cell, and for that matter, platelet transfusions, is a significant comorbidity or issue that surrounds patients with myelofibrosis, and is one, up to now, has really been an unmet need, and is one that I get from this meeting as a continued object of, or goal of therapy that's very important. Progression of disease to AML, I can't tell you how many times I've had this discussion, and it doesn't have to be always a person with advanced myelofibrosis that has the ASXL1 mutation and some blast circulating that's now thinking about the progression. It can be the ET patient that was just diagnosed that is now reading and understanding that there's a potential for progression of disease from myelofibrosis to acute leukemia and sometimes even to straight acute leukemia. Thankfully, this happens in the minority of patients with ET, but one never knows if they're going to fit in that minority of patients. So the psychological and emotional baggage of that worry, I appreciate more and more, and I realize how that affects patients on a day-to-day basis because they're always waiting for that shoe to drop. They never know when they may show up to their hematologist's office and their blood counts may have changed in a significant way, and they're having a conversation that's quite different than the conversation before. So therapies that that address not simply symptoms, which we talked about, which are obviously very important, not simply reducing spleen, which is obviously has importance in many patients, but therapies that have a meaningful impact in the disease at the biological level so that the blasts are no longer circulating, the bone marrow looks more normal. And
I know what you mean.
that you are less likely to transform to AML. You're less likely to have a fatal outcome from this disease. These are the kind of treatments that I know that we really aspire to have. So there are short-term or short goal treatments, as someone pointed out, of risk reduction, reducing the risk of thrombosis, improving symptom burdens, all very important. And then there are these longer-term, also meaningful endpoints of disease course modification. And these are goals that we strive for every day as we translate laboratory to clinical findings, hoping that we can change the paradigm in which we treat patients and that at some point we will have therapies that will change the course of the disease so that we're no longer trying to address and spot weld things and hoping that nothing drops the next visit. Transplant was brought up today. Transplant is a major aspect of the care of patients with myelofibrosis, but only a fraction of patients actually get to transplant. Most patients with myelofibrosis are too advanced in age or too sick to get to transplant. And one of the things that Ruben pointed out that I agree, today's meeting was fantastic. We heard from a variety of different patients who have experienced a variety of different aspects of the MPN course, but what really was lacking, and is probably a function of the severity of the disease, are those advanced patients with myelofibrosis that couldn't make it to the meeting because they were either too sick or they were too encumbered by their treatment or were getting geared up for transplant or in transplant or post-transplant. The burden of transplant is not easy. We would love to have therapies, and I tell my transplant colleagues all the time, we would love to have therapies that avoid transplant, put them out of business. You don't need transplant anymore. But right now, transplant remains the only curative approach, and unfortunately is really only available to a minority of patients, and it's a difficult procedure to go through. So we're aware of that. The idea of trials, I've thought about this a lot. I didn't prepare anything for today, and specifically didn't because I wanted to speak off the cuff and from the heart and be inspired by what I saw today. And this is a conversation I have all the time, is what is the point of a trial and how does it help an individual? And I look at it two ways. And I've seen a lot of patients enroll in clinical trials because they're there to see if they can help themselves. And I've seen a lot of patients who blow me away who enroll in clinical trials because they're hoping that their contribution will help the greater good. And that always impresses me. It never fails to do so. Most patients are doing it for both, I think, are probably doing it to help themselves and help the greater good. And obviously, patients don't want placebo. And whenever we can design a trial in conjunction with FDA input, we don't want to have a placebo. We would rather have a best available therapy. So at least you're comparing standard of care therapy to something that's hopefully better than standard of care therapy. And I think what's really important for the group to understand is that therapies today that are being evaluated in clinical trial, I think are different than 30 years ago or 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. And the therapies that are being evaluated today are really informed from laboratory research. And that's what's really important. When one looks at clinicaltrials.gov or speaks to their hematologist, it's really important to feel comfortable that a therapy that's being explored in your patient population in which you may be eligible is one that's not picked off a tree or randomly, is one that is informed by laboratory research that provides a clear rationale and is something that is more likely to impact you and your disease than just taking something off the shelf and hoping that it works, because that doesn't work. So one needs to have faith and believe in and trust the system, but also has to do their due diligence and look at what's being evaluated and participate in that process. And obviously, the patients who came here are part of that group, but not all patients are. So, Jean had said something before that struck me as quite profound. There's an element here in which you guys can also help those patients who aren't here help navigate the system, which is quite complicated. And even that means with the financial support. And when we negotiate with companies, contractually and budget-wise, to open up a trial, we do try to put in a stipend for travel, because I know it's expensive to come to New York City. It's expensive to park a car. It's expensive to stay overnight. So we're aware of these things, and we do try to build that in. And for the most part, companies, particularly today, are are sensitive to that and do want to contribute and facilitate the process. So that is something that we will continue to work hard on. I think that enrollment in clinical trial, and I'm highly biased, I'm a trialist, and I say this all the time, I think it's the key to the future of moving this field forward. And I think what we've learned today is we have to look beyond the old parameters of success that we used. The disease is obviously more than a spleen. It's more than just shrinking a spleen by 35% spleen volume reduction. There's a significant symptom burden, and it can differ and be particular to different people. There are patients that have red blood cell transfusion dependence. We need to get them out of the infusion suite. There are patients that are fearful and, in some cases, imminently fearful of evolution of the disease. We need therapies that are more effective. We need patients to enroll in these trials and feel confident in enrolling in these trials. So, to me, I've learned a lot from this meeting. I appreciate the fact that we have patients, FDA and pharmaceutical companies all in the same room with the same goal. I believe it's the same goal. Even if the agendas are slightly different, the goal is the same. And I appreciate the FDA's difficult position. They're there to protect and to make sure that what we do as investigators doesn't put anyone at jeopardy, doesn't lead down the wrong road, whereas patients want therapies, and we have to work together as a group to make sure that we can accomplish that. So I think this was a terrific, at least in the MPN world, terrific first step to do that. I'm proud to be a part of it and sit here with Ruben, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Well, why don't we hand it over to our moderator, Mr. Valentine, to bring us home. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's actually me, and I promise you I will not speak for 10 minutes because I'm not going to, snare you in traffic or late to your plane. So I just want to say one more time, thank you so much to the people who came here to participate on the panels, to participate in the discussion, and on the webinar. I speak to patients and I hear from patients every day of my life, literally. There's no like 9 to 5 in this field of work. So I have the benefit of experiencing and hearing what you're saying all the time. But there was something about being here today with a full day, with all the people in the room from the different areas that really struck a chord and underlined what we're all trying to do here. And Dr. Mascarenas and Dr. Mesa summarized it so beautifully that we're all playing a certain part in the world of MPN advocates. And I think that through this process and through this meeting, hopefully we're getting closer to understanding what that really looks like and moving the needle forward for all of you. We were talking about having a word cloud of some kind to capture some of the things we heard. But the things that we're feeling from you who have expressed what you're going through is resilience, it's strength, it's perseverance. And, we want to make sure that we're doing our part as advocates in meeting that and pushing for what you have expressed your greatest needs are. So thank you again. And thank you one more time to James Valentine for being a wonderful facilitator and really helping us with this meeting. And thank you to the FDA for creating this opportunity for us and for Ann Farrell to spend the whole day with us and be in our world, and her staff, and Meghana Chalasani for really, again, guiding us and helping us through the preparation for this meeting. So on that note, I thank you all for your time and attention today. I also want to mention that if you didn't get to speak your piece, you can still do so for a whole month. You can email your comments on any aspect of this, if you're someone living with PV, ETU, or MF, to communications@mpnrf.org. And believe me, we will broadcast that more after the meeting as well. So once again, thank you, and have a great day.